hunter-gatherers built Stonehenge's older cousin. Here, on a remote hilltop in Upper Mesopotamia, they raised 20-ton pillars, without farms, without cities, without writing. The earliest enclosures here date to around 9,600 BCE, more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge's construction, around 3,000 BCE, which means everything we thought we knew about the order of civilization is backwards. This is the story of a site that rewrites the origin of human complexity and forces us to ask whether ritual built civilization or civilization built ritual. This is no history. The misconception, evidence. The standard story of human civilization has a clear sequence. Hunter-gatherers roam. Eventually, someone plants a seed. Farming produces surplus food. Surplus feeds specialists, priests, builders, administrators. And those specialists, freed from foraging, create the first complex societies. It's a logical chain, and for most of the 20th century, archaeology seemed to confirm it. The oldest temples appeared in societies that already had cities. The oldest cities appeared in societies that already had agriculture. Sequence locked. I accepted this model without question. Most people do. It feels like common sense. You can't organize thousands of people to haul stone unless you can feed them. And you can't feed them without farms. So farms must come first. The monument is always the last thing, the reward at the end of the chain, not the beginning. But then, in the hills of southeastern Turkey, something turned up that the model simply cannot explain. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited a site that had been flagged decades earlier by American researcher Peter Benedict. Benedict spotted the hilltop in the 1960s, a scatter of flint tools on the surface, an unusual mound shape, noted it in a survey, and moved on. The site sat in the literature, unexcavated, for 30 years. It took Schmidt to realize what was buried there. He returned with excavation equipment, and what came out of the ground was not what anyone expected. Not a simple scatter of tools, not a modest campsite. Something else entirely. The site sits on a ridge above the Harran Plain in southeastern Turkey, the edge of Upper Mesopotamia. The bedrock is limestone, and carved from that limestone, buried under meters of deliberately packed fill, were circles. Geophysical surveys suggest at least 20 enclosures exist across the ridge, most still unexcavated. We have seen only a fraction of what is there. Each enclosure contained T-shaped pillars arranged in a ring, with two larger central pillars facing each other. Some pillars stood 5.5 meters tall. Some weighed up to 20 tons, and they were covered in carvings, deliberate, detailed, varied carvings that took skill and time. Schmidt dated the site. Construction of earliest enclosures at Göbekli Tepe begins around 9600 BCE. Pre-pottery Neolithic A, before pottery, before writing, before any evidence of systematic agriculture in the region. By the old model, humans simply should not have been capable of this. The sequence said monuments come last. This monument came first. This was not supposed to exist. Let's look at what was actually built here, because the details matter. They matter because each detail is a decision. Someone chose the shape. Someone chose the animal. Someone chose the placement. And those choices, made 11,000 years ago, are still legible in stone. The T-shape is not random. When you look at the central pillars closely, you notice something. They have arms. Low-relief carvings along the sides of the shaft, hands, bent at the elbow, resting at the front. The pillars have belts carved in stone. They have loincloths. The T-cap at the top sits where a head would be. These are not abstract columns. They are stylized human figures, enormous, faceless, but unmistakably anthropomorphic. Someone decided that the thing standing at the center of each enclosure should look like a body. Not a wall, not a boundary marker, a presence. The animal carvings are the second puzzle. Foxes, snakes, boars, cranes, vultures, aurochs, scorpions. The repertoire is wide, but the distribution is not random. Certain animals cluster in certain enclosures. Certain combinations repeat. Some scholars read this as group markers, different communities identifying themselves through animal symbols when they gathered here. Others see cosmological symbolism. The vulture, a carrion bird, appears repeatedly in association with death imagery across later Near Eastern traditions, and its prominence at Göbekli Tepe may not be coincidental. We cannot be certain which reading is correct, but the patterning is deliberate, and it is consistent across generations of construction. These were not random decorations. They were a system, a visual language spoken across the site, across the decades, across the communities that converged here. The third puzzle is the scale of coordination required. The limestone was quarried from the bedrock of the ridge itself. Unfinished pillars have been found still attached to the quarry floor, one of the most important finds at the site, giving us a direct window into the process. Workers used flint tools, no metal, to cut around the pillars. The marks are still visible in the stone. Experimental archaeology suggests moving a 20-ton stone up that slope required hundreds of people working in coordination. Not dozens, hundreds. And every one of them had to eat, multiple times a day, for weeks, possibly months, across construction seasons spanning centuries. The site was actively used, with enclosures built and modified from roughly 9600 BCE through approximately 8000 BCE, a span of more than 1600 years. Generation after generation returned to this hill and kept building. Here is where the model starts to fracture completely. The bones found at Göbekli Tepe are almost exclusively wild animals: gazelle, aurochs, wild boar. Thousands of bones representing enormous quantities of meat consumed at the site. No evidence of domesticated species. No evidence of grain storage at scale. The people who built this were, by every material indicator, mobile hunter-gatherers. They were not farmers who built a temple. They were foragers who organized a construction project that ran for over 1,000 years. Which raises the question Klaus Schmidt spent the rest of his career wrestling with. What were they doing here? And how did they sustain it? The site was not a settlement. No hearths for domestic living, no storage pits, no evidence of year-round habitation in the enclosures themselves. It appears to have been a gathering place, people converging seasonally from a wide surrounding region. Communities that spent most of their lives dispersed across the landscape came together here. They quarried stone. They carved pillars. They feasted on wild game in quantities that required coordinated hunting across large territories. And then, presumably, they dispersed again. Generations of people returned to this hill. They built new enclosures. They maintained old ones. The enclosures themselves show evidence of modification over time. Pillars repositioned, walls rebuilt. This was not a single event. It was an institution, a place that held meaning across a span of time longer than the entire history of the Western Roman Empire. Now here is where the evidence points somewhere genuinely strange. The Fertile Crescent, the region directly surrounding Göbekli Tepe, is where the earliest evidence of wheat domestication appears in the archaeological record. The wild progenitors of einkorn wheat grew on the slopes of the Karakada Mountains, less than 30 miles from the site. And that domestication process begins to show up in the record near the end of Göbekli Tepe's active use period, or shortly after, roughly 8,500 to 8,000 BCE. The proximity is not proof of causation. Scholars are careful about that. But the hypothesis that has gained serious traction among researchers, including Klaus Schmidt, who spent much of his career investigating it, is this. Gathering at a site like Göbekli Tepe, feeding hundreds of people repeatedly across generations, created pressure to produce more food, reliably, predictably. The ritual site may have generated the demand that agriculture eventually answered. The feast drove the farm. Other scholars propose different drivers: climate shifts, population pressure, independent invention. But the idea that ritual coordination preceded and contributed to agricultural adoption has become central to current Neolithic research. Religion didn't follow civilization. It may have built it. This is not a fringe idea. It's the central hypothesis driving current scholarly debate around Göbekli Tepe, referenced in peer-reviewed literature precisely because it forces a rethinking of the causal sequence that archaeologists had treated as settled for decades. Schmidt published on this throughout his career until his death in 2014. The debate he opened is still active. We should be honest about what we don't know. We don't know the specific beliefs of the people who built here. We don't know whether the enclosures were open to everyone or restricted to certain groups. Whether this was a public gathering or something more exclusive. We don't know what social structure organized the labor. The proximity and timing of early wheat domestication are suggestive, but establishing direct causation requires evidence beyond archaeological correlation. The absence of writing means the builders left no explanation, only the stones. And then, around 8,000 BCE, something happened that makes the site even stranger. The builders buried it, deliberately, systematically. This detail gets overlooked. The deliberate and systematic burial of the enclosures was not the result of abandonment or erosion. Stratigraphic analysis shows the fill was brought in intentionally, packed with debris, animal bones, stone tools, soil, broken objects. The pillars were buried up to their tops. Someone organized this. Someone gave the order, or reached the consensus, and the work was done. The fill itself is informative. It contains the residue of activity, the bones of feasting, the discarded tools of construction and use. This wasn't clean soil dumped to seal a space. It was the accumulated material of the gatherings themselves, packed back in. The site was closed with its own history. Why? Several interpretations exist. Some scholars suggest ritual closure, decommissioning a sacred space in a structured way, the way later cultures would seal tombs or retire sacred objects. Others suggest newer enclosures were built over older ones as part of a cycle of renewal. That burying an enclosure was how you made room, physically and symbolically, for what came next. Others note that the act preserved the site, whether intentionally or not, in a way that kept it intact for 11,000 years. The fill that hid Göbekli Tepe from the world also saved it. None of these interpretations is proven. All of them are taken seriously. What the burial tells us, regardless of interpretation, is that the people who built Göbekli Tepe made a choice. A considered, organized, multi-generational choice. They had a relationship with this place that was structured and intentional, spanning centuries. And when they were done, they chose to end it in a specific way. Not abandonment. Conclusion. What Göbekli Tepe actually rewrites is not just a date on a timeline. It rewrites the logic of human organization. The assumption that complexity requires surplus, and surplus requires agriculture, and agriculture requires settled life. That assumption placed belief, ritual, and meaning at the end of the chain. The last luxury. Something humans built after they had solved the practical problems. Göbekli Tepe suggests meaning may have come first. That the drive to gather, to mark space, to build something that outlasts a single life, that drive may be what made humans organize at scale in the first place. Not the result of civilization, the engine of it. These T-shaped pillars, this buried ridge in southeastern Turkey, remind us that humans were asking large questions long before they had large answers. And that the act of asking, of gathering to ask together, of hauling 20 tons of limestone uphill to make the question visible, may be what changed everything about how we live. If Göbekli Tepe's enclosures were deliberately buried by their own builders, what were they preserving, and from whom? We dig into the evidence, not the legend, to understand how humans actually organized themselves before writing recorded the story. Those T-shaped pillars, the carved arms, the belts, the specific animal reliefs chosen for each enclosure, were communicating something to the people who stood inside those circles. Klaus Schmidt spent 20 years trying to read that message. Was each pillar a clan ancestor, a boundary between the living and the dead?
A figure that only made sense if you already knew the code? Pick the carving that confuses you most, the vulture, the fox, the faceless torso, and say what you think it meant to the person who put it there. Keep digging.